We are going global today with my top 10 historical fiction books of all time set around the world. As many of you know, I love reading books from a whole range of different countries, so I'm covering almost all the continents with these, and I've tried not to do historical fiction books that are from the same country as well. Hi, for anyone who's new here, I'm Steffi from Books That Teach Us. I read books and I share the key takeaways from them and what I've learned so that you can decide if they're the right books for you. I currently have a free book quiz you can go and take to get your next recommendation tailored to your answers. So go check that out below. Okay, I'm going to get probably the most emotional book out the way first, which is Homegoing by Jaap Gyasi. Before I do, a quick word from our sponsor, My Book Globe. I'm so excited to share my book globe with you all. I have been working on this interactive clickable map which spins and gives you book recommendations, all curated and read by me from all around the world. Every time I read a book from a new country, I will add it to the map, so the map is only going to keep on growing. Now, I do actually have a whole single video dedicated to this book because I thought it was so powerful and so important. For any of you who don't know, Jaap Gyasi is a Ghanaian American writer, and this is probably the historical fiction book that broke me the most. It spans a couple of centuries, starting around the mid-1700s with the rise of the transatlantic slave trade. And it essentially tells the story of Africa and the Americas through multiple generations of one family. It is so incredibly heart-wrenching, triggering, very deeply upsetting. I think this is absolutely, as you can imagine with the topic of slavery, not a light-hearted read. And many parts of this, I had to pause for a moment. I had to put it down. I had to go walk away and cry. It is one of those books that will just deeply move you, mainly because we use the word fiction, but everything in this happened and could totally have been feasible for people to really experience this. So we start off in Africa, and I learned a lot about the different tribal nations that were around in the 17 and 1800s, lots of kingdoms like the Asantes and the Fante kingdom. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing them correctly. Let me know below if you can help me with my pronunciation. And we essentially see two half-sisters. There's a family tree at the beginning with who the two sisters are related to. And it's one of those really intriguing books in terms of characters because each chapter is told from the next generation down from a character there. Quite often female characters, but there's a few male characters in there as well. And one of the sisters at the beginning, she marries a white slaver, and they live on the African coast, are part of the kidnapping and transporting of children and people to the Americas. The other sister becomes enslaved herself, is kidnapped, raped, tortured, and put in one of the boats across to the Americas. And then it follows her next generation down all the way to essentially current day. And it makes me tear up just thinking about it. It is so incredibly powerful. I think it's a book that everybody should read. I would say particularly if you're American or European, because I think these things we know about, but I feel like we've never heard it like this. And I think we all need to hear about it like this because it also makes you realize like how not long ago that was. And I'm always saying this to my students. I'm a teacher, and they think the 1800s were, so long ago when these things happened. And I think some adults think that, well, it's not really relevant nowadays, is it? But when I think about my own family, and my great grandmother was born in the 1800s, that's not really that long ago, is it? Like, she knew about me. She knew that I was on the way. And I think this really hits home with how it's not that long ago at all, particularly when we focus on families. I would say I learned a lot about this, obviously a lot about like African nations and tribal communities, a lot of interesting routine and activities that were happening there, the way families were structured there, the way slavery actually existed there in quite a different form to when the white colonizers started to get involved and kidnap people. I learned quite a lot about different areas of history across the US. So I learned a lot about Birmingham, I guess is how you pronounce it in America, and about the miners there and how a lot of Black people who were then treated in terrible conditions in the mines there, alongside prisoners too. And so I learned quite a lot about that. It's quite interesting. The civil rights movement is much more like a backdrop. She didn't really focus on that at all. It's much more focused on the families and how they're navigating things. And, you know, obviously there's some characters that go to marches and it references that, but that's very much in the backdrop. And it's also really fascinating, the storyline that's always staying in Africa the whole time, and different areas in different countries there. And I learned quite a lot about that too. And quite a lot how people were treated when they were different or looked different. And a lot about I think we could say animism, like the religious beliefs in spirits. And so that side of it was really interesting. But do not read this if you are not feeling kind of mentally strong, because it's just gut wrenching and one of those books that will stay with you forever, which is why I absolutely recommend you read it when you feel you have the ability to do so. Okay, for my next book, I'm going to talk about Miss Burma by Charmaine Craig. And in a way, similar to the Homegoing book, it's one of those ones where, yes, it's fiction, but also it's kind of not fiction because some of these things really happen to Charmaine Craig's own family members. And obviously some of the things are like reimagined conversations. I'm sure there's some artistic license in there, but a lot of it is true. And it taught me so much about the country of Myanmar or Burma, hence it's called Miss Burma. Some of my main takeaways were obviously the effects of the British colonization in Burma. I live in Thailand, so it's our country next door. And it just really opened my eyes to how little I knew. We get taught, I've complained about this before, at history at school, we do not touch on colonization in any real way, to be honest. And I know there's been a lot of people campaigning for a change in what is taught in schools in the UK. But if you want to know more, then I think this book is a great starting point. So it talks a lot about all the different communities within the country of Burma. And I didn't realize that, like, the Burmese, it's actually an ethnicity that made up at the time when she was writing. It expands the last 100 years of Burmese history. During those 100 years, like, the Burmese made up like 50% of the population, and all these other ethnicities and different communities made up the other 50%. So, for example, like the Karens, which is a tribe that we have here in Thailand as well and is across the border. And some of you have probably heard of the Rohingya as well, who have been treated very despicably. And there's a lot of discrimination against the Rohingya Muslims at the current day. So I think this book just really like opened my eyes in a very readable way, because it follows a family and a generation there. It's called Miss Burma because Charmaine Craig's own mother was in a beauty contest, which is all very bizarre. It's this backdrop of all this fighting that is happening, the war that is ongoing, the oppression and the colonization, the infighting. And I learned so much that in such a very vivid way by reading this book. So I really recommend it if you're interested in this region where I live, if you're interested in the history of Burma, because it really starts to explain a lot. It definitely left me with a lot of questions about things too, which I think is what any good book does. Okay, my next one is The Poisonwood Bible by Barbara Kingsolver. If you've been here a while, you'll know I love Barbara Kingsolver and her writing. She's got such range. Like, some of the books I've read, I can't believe they're the same author, because she's just can write quite so differently in different contexts. But this one just gobsmacked me. So again, it talks about colonization, and in particular missionary colonizers in the Congo, which I knew nothing about. It was a Belgian colony. And if you were around in the 60s, you've probably heard about some of the atrocities that happened there. And also explains why the Congo and that region is so unstable now as well, because of all this backdrop that happened. But it starts in the 60s through to a bit more current day. And it talks about one white missionary family who moved to the Congo to try and convert the local people. And it just really vilifies like the main man in the family. You feel so angry at him. You learn a lot about like the arrogance of people doing so-called missionary work. And it just made me so angry. Just the superiority that people felt, maybe still feel, I don't know, to like think that they know better than other people who actually live there, than the Congolese who were there. This very traumatic and turbulent time in history with the Democratic Republic of Congo becoming independent, trying to shake off colonial rule, the clinging on of European empires to their colonies, and what they will do for that. And there's obviously a lot for them to answer for. But I think this book was just so powerful in making me feel so many very strong emotions. And I learned so much from it. I've actually just thought there's 2 extra books I'm going to throw in at the end that I really enjoyed. Maybe not as strong historically, but I might mention these 2 at the end because I've really been enjoying them lately. Okay, I'm bouncing back across to Asia now, and this time to Vietnam. And I'm going to choose the book Saigon by Anthony Gray, which I wish I hadn't returned to the library because I want to show you it, because it's like this fat, but so worth it. And I might have mentioned this one before on my BookTube channel too, but Anthony Gray is like a fantastic storyteller. He's actually a journalist, which I think really comes through in these observations of people. And it's a multi-generational saga that pretty much explains the last 100 years of Vietnamese history. And so we start off, there's Vietnamese families, there's a French family who were the colonizers in Vietnam at the time. And then more political turmoil, and it taught me quite a lot about the Vietnamese War. So when the Americans invaded, about the divisions between the North and South of Vietnam, which was part of the Vietnamese War. It was a civil war as well as the outside influence. Ho Chi Minh, who was a hero of Vietnam, he's actually one of the characters in the book, but he appears and disappears and things, and one of the characters is following him very closely. So I quite liked that he had this cameo role, I guess, in the novel. I just think it explains things so beautifully from different viewpoints as well, following these different families and the different experiences of what happened in Vietnam. Okay, my next one, I'm bouncing now to South America. And I have gone for House of the Spirits by Isabel Allende. I'm a huge Isabel Allende fan. I'm planning to do like a booktube of lots of her books. I might read a couple more first to add to my playlist there. But subscribe if you're interested in that in the future. So Isabel Allende, for anyone who's new to her, is like the queen of magical realism. And that is very much intertwined in House of the Spirits with history and with what happened. And what's really interesting is Isabel Allende actually never names the country this is about, but it's kind of assumed that it is about Chile in South America and what happened with the rise of a dictatorship and the oppression of the people of Chile. Again, it follows one family over this time period, which is, my favorite. I'm gonna do a playlist of like intergenerational family books too. But it's basically like lots of the 20th century of Chile and the people there. So there's a lot about uprising, civil unrest that happens. There's some very traumatic incident that happens in it. So again, this should come with a bit of a trigger warning about torture and sexual violence. There's a lot I learned about like the military coup that happened there, which actually affected Isabella Allende's own family, as I believe it was her uncle was a politician. Although again, he's not named in it, which I think works in quite an interesting way to not openly say it. I just a huge Isabella Allende fan. And just a side note, which was a bit upsetting, don't trust the movie. It's got Meryl Streep in it, so I thought it was going to be fantastic, but it's not. It's very deeply disappointing. They should totally do a remake of House of the Spirits, because I think it would be so amazing on the big screen, especially with all the magical realism things that happen in it. Like, I think it would be super cinematic. But yeah, don't trust the version with Meryl Streep. Sorry. My next one is again a really fat book. And this time we're going over to the country of Georgia. So I feel like it's a little bit like Euro-Asia spans 2 continents for my diverse book list there. And it's called The Eighth Life, and then Fulbroca in brackets, by Nino Haratishvili. I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that properly. And actually, I named one of my foster cats Nino after this book because I loved it so much. And again, huge multi-generational story of the last 100 years of Georgian history. So it covers a lot about the Soviet Union, things I really didn't know anything about. And the invasion of Russia, the rise of Stalin, and just so much there, like obviously told through the eyes of individual people and characters. And then we see within it the rise of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Soviet Union. As this backdrop, you see different characters having different political... Stalin is actually a minor character in it. And I think it's interesting. A bit like the Saigon one with Ho Chi Minh, he's not a named person in it. Obviously, I'm aware about Stalin associated with Russia, but I did not know that he was born in Georgia. He was Georgian. So that was quite eye-opening to me, for sure. I felt like compared with some of the other books, there's like a bit of lighter relief in some of the things that happen, though again, needs a trigger warning for torture and sexual violence too. But I thought it was just such a fantastic story, and I learned so much about things that literally I had no idea about. And now I really want to visit Georgia. Georgia was on my list before this book, but it made me want to go even more so because it's just such a fascinating place. Okay, my next book is actually... I know I said Homegoing was really emotional, but this next one's really emotional as well. And it is called The Mercies by Kieran Millward Hargrove. And this book broke me a little bit and made me equally super, super mad and angry. So definitely one that moved me and that I remember so clearly as well. So it's all set in the 1600s in Norway, which is not a place that I think I know much about, and certainly not in the 1600s. And it basically, right at the beginning of the book, a huge tsunami comes and it wipes out all of the men who are fishers, and they're out fishing and they all die. So it leaves behind this quite isolated community of women who are then left to fend for themselves and have to start to do things by themselves. And you kind of start off reading it and you're thinking, oh my God, it's going to be this amazing story of like female empowerment and how they cope when they've lost their husbands and fathers. And it's not that at all. Again, it's touches on very real events. So the storm that happened was actually true. And what happens is there is then religious persecution, and a commissioner arrives from Scotland. It's like basically the men, the authorities are so threatened by the fact that these women all have independence financially and are able to work. They then persecute them as witches. And basically, it goes into, I don't know how to pronounce the word, but it's called the Bardo witch trials. So similar to the Salem witch trials, they just basically went around accusing and murdering women. And it is so heartbreaking. It makes me so angry because I think even to this day, we still have these like ridiculous things about like, oh, you know, witches were burnt in this area. No, women were murdered in that area. And there has never been any acknowledgement that I am aware of a government, of authority figures for what has happened to women over generations for simply being themselves, being independent, having a cat. And yeah, I think there's still, even now, mentioned this before, but there's a bridge I was at in Germany and it said, oh, witches used to be thrown off this bridge to see if they would sink. And if they sank, then it meant that they weren't witches, that they'd been murdered anyway. Yeah. And I'm like, you don't mean witches, you mean women. Women were murdered here by their communities. And it's just, yeah. Okay. I try not to flirt the handle about this one, but this book is just so fantastic. Brings up all the emotions. There is like a love story woven in, so there are some softer parts to the very horrific things. Again, trigger warnings, torture, misogyny, sexual violence, and yeah, just it is absolutely breathtaking. It's actually, I think, the only book I've ever read by this author. So I think I'm going to go seek some others of hers out. If you guys have read any other ones by her, please let me know. Okay, my next one is also very emotional. It couldn't not be. It is Half of a Yellow Sun by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. I'm a huge Adichie fan. I've read lots of her books and watched one of her TED Talks as well, which is really fascinating. And basically, in this book, I learned about a war that I had never heard of before. And I feel very ignorant saying that, but I hadn't. And that is what is known as the Biafra War, or sometimes it's called the Nigerian Civil War. So it covers, I would say, from the 60s, mostly from the 60s, and what happened there, which is known to be one of the worst humanitarian crises in the last 100 years, I would say, and like the lack of what the international community did to help people who were being tortured, murdered, absolute starved to death, widespread famine. But yeah, makes me emotional thinking about it. So it is told through the story of two. One of them is married to a white Brit. So I feel like that's quite important with all of the British Empire's history of colonizing that area and what is current day Nigeria. I learned a lot more about like the different tribal communities within Nigeria, which is still very important to this day. Sometimes you look at Nigeria and you think, why are you one country? Colonization, because there are so many distinct communities that are there, so many different languages. I think I read somewhere that there are over 400 languages in Nigeria. And this is particularly what happened to the Igbo people during their attempt to become autonomous, and because they did not want to be swallowed into Nigeria. They wanted their own land. They wanted to have their own area, their own government. It's really good because it covers different classes of people as well. So we see like the sisters as being like more elite, the Igbo people, and have studied abroad, very educated professors. One of the storylines follows like the servant, the houseboy, he's called, who works in the house. So then we see the working class and how it affected them. And so I think it's really powerful to cover all those. I also found it quite helpful because there's obviously like the white British character in there as well. So you can see things through his eyes, which I think is helpful because it links to like the British Empire and the colonization and how that all plays into what happened with the atrocities during the Biafra War. Just very heartbreaking. Again, huge trigger warnings for all of the things above, all of the things previously mentioned. Some really, really brutal, violent scenes in it as well, which is what really happened. And I can't believe I didn't really know about this. And I asked my mum, she was born in the 50s, and she was saying, yes, like we were aware of it happening. It was this international humanitarian crisis. And basically there was a blockade, so they couldn't get any food in. And yeah, really emotional. Okay, my next one also made me cry. It is maybe I'm just an emotional mess. It is The Island of Sea Women by Lisa C. Again, a little bit, it reminds me of The Mercies a little bit, where you've got this full focus on female communities. And this one was so exciting to me because it focuses on Jeju Island in South Korea and the female free divers who are there. So they are, I believe, there to this day. They are famous because they would free dive down, very impressive free diving skills, something I am not good at. And they would collect particularly sea urchins to be sold. So they were like the main earners. I think the men in the communities were fishers, but it was the women who were particularly strong at free diving. And I believe there's actually some research going on about suggesting that women's bodies are better adapted for free diving skills, which is quite cool too. And it then explains what happens during World War II when the Japanese invade. And I am always really keen to learn more about this, because having grown up in the UK, we learned a lot about World War II. And to be honest with you, I did not know Asia was involved when I came out of secondary school. And I really enjoyed history because we didn't learn anything about it. We were very focused on Nazi Germany and everything that happened there, which is obviously very relevant being part of Europe. But I guess if we'd had to talk about Asia, we'd have had to talk about colonization. That was just really skimmed across. And so I'm always really curious and keen to understand what happened in Asia. Obviously, the area I live in now during World War II. So this was the brutal invasion of Japanese soldiers. A lot there about what it means to survive, to what extent people collaborated with the Japanese, the Koreans, when people resisted them. Again, it's all told through this sea diving community, and about two best friends and the different paths that they take during this kind of turmoil in history. There was a horrendous massacre that happened that happens in the story. There's also throws up a lot of questions about traditions and whether future families of the freediving community can continue living like this. It can be quite dangerous, some of the things that they do with freediving. So it touches on that as well. There's a past storyline and a more present day storyline set in the 2000s. So I think that helps to place it generationally as well with everything that happened. But yeah, I think this is probably one of my favorite books. I mean, these are all my favorite books. I'm going to stop saying that. Okay, but I'm going to finish on the book that I always say is my favorite. And it is one of the favorites. And it's not quite as traumatic. Is it? Yeah, not quite as traumatic as some of the other books on my list. And I'm talking about The Far Pavilions by MMK. She is a writer who is British, but actually grew up in India. And so lots of her books are based there. It is set all in the 1800s, so during British colonial rule in India, and I learned so much from that. I first read this book, I think I was 16 or 17, and many, many years later, I went to India and actually visited some of the places where it's set, particularly the Hawa Mahal Palace, which just gave me goosebumps to think, oh my gosh, I read this amazing book that was set there in the palace. So basically, the story follows Ash, who is a young boy growing up in India. And he actually believes he's Indian because he's adopted by an Indian family. And then a bit later on, this is not a spoiler, but a bit later on, he discovers that he is actually white British and is removed to the UK and goes to boarding school there, has an awful time. They force him to eat meat, whereas he was brought up in a Hindu household. Then he is just desperate to get back to India, but he comes back as a soldier for the British. And so there's just some really fascinating moral, ethical dilemmas that this character comes across in his role, as he kind of sees himself as Indian, but he's obviously not. And it covers what is known as the Indian Mutiny. So it was where the Indians who were employed by the British actually rose up against the colonizers who were employing them. And very violent scenes from that. And this book, I think, is so interesting because it starts off as this big adventure story. There's a bit of a love story that happens through it. There's some focus on Indian royalty. And I'm not going to give any spoilers, but one of the really awful things that it talks about, which I had no idea about, was this tradition of sati that happened, which basically said when an Indian royal man died, his wives were expected to burn themselves alive on his funeral pyre. And there's a section of this in the book. And when I went to India, I actually saw one of the parts of the tradition was that the women, some of them girls, really young girls that were married off to these old men, and they would dip their hands in paint and they would put their handprints against a part of the palace wall before going to be burned alive. And I saw the handprints, and it was just, oh, like it really got me to think about the girls and women that were basically forced to do that. Like they didn't have a choice. So that really opened my eyes to this tradition that happened there. The second kind of, or last third of the book perhaps, almost changes completely. And I learned so much about what became the second Anglo-Afghan War. So obviously over the last 200 years, the area of South Asia has changed hugely because of political and colonial decisions that were made. And so this was fighting in the mountains of the Hindu Kush. And so I learned a lot about that geographical area and about the Afghans and how there was a lot of fighting because the British Empire wanted to control them. And so part of it is then actually set in Kabul in Afghanistan. And I found out afterwards, like all the characters are fictional until this point, and it actually references real military soldiers, colonels that were there and part of this war that happened. So that really hit home to me as well. So I feel like this book is one of those books that doesn't really have a genre, which I am going to do a playlist about, so subscribe if you're interested in that. But yeah, it just merges like all these different genres together and is just blew my mind wide open. So I definitely recommend it. If you're here this long, I've got two little quick ones I'm going to mention about. I also want to mention the book Women of Troublesome Creek, and I'm not going to go into it because I have a whole single video on this book, but read it if you're interested in the Appalachian Mountains in Kentucky in the 1930s. If you love librarians, the main character was part of this badass set of women who were pack horse librarians in very remote local areas so that communities there were able to read and get access to books. Absolutely amazing. Also covers a family who were blue because of a very rare genetic mutation in their genes. Cannot recommend enough. Like, the characters are fictional, but everything that happened in this is true. Also want to mention, this is not so much historical fiction, but I absolutely love it. I've just posted it on my Lighthouse Books one, but it's all set in Australia, in a lighthouse in the 1930s, and a lot of things that are repercussions of World War I. So I wanted to give it a shout out in my historical books. Thank you for listening. Subscribe if you want more book recommendations from me, Steffi at Books That Teach Us.